Hello everybody, you're listening to the Difficult Conversations podcast series with me, Poppy Gerrard-Abbott, and today we're going to be talking about COVID-19 and gender-based violence, or GBV. I'm very lucky to be joined by two very special guests, the first being Fiona Drouet, GBV campaigner, mother, founder and CEO of the Scottish charity The Emily Test, set up in memory of her daughter Emily Drouet. This charity is part of the fight to end GBV in higher and further education and aims to improve support provisions, policies and procedures around GBV for students. Among its many projects, the charity is in the process of creating a very exciting gender-based violence charter, which is a Scottish government-funded project for all Scottish universities and colleges. And I'm very proud to say that I'm connected with that incredible work as the researcher on the project. Secondly, I'm very pleased to welcome Lauren O'Rourke, who has an incredible history of working in GBV and violence against women work. She started off on the Rape Crisis Scotland helpline as one of their vital volunteers. She used to work at Rape Crisis Glasgow and is now the training and education coordinator for further and higher education at Rape Crisis Scotland. Lauren also works as a counsellor for victim survivors at Forth Valley Rape Crisis Centre. Listeners, it's an exceptionally busy and pressurised time for GBV professionals and campaigners at the moment during the COVID-19 pandemic, so we are extremely lucky to be having them here with us today. So today we will be focusing on how COVID is gendered. Headlines are telling us that the lockdown measures are seeing increases in domestic violence, violence against women, and moving our lives online is being met with increases in cyber abuse, cyber stalking, and revenge pornography. GBV professionals are facing significant increases in calls to their helplines, and meanwhile, feminists have been writing and talking about how many other aspects of the pandemic are gendered, such as frontline professionals being disproportionately women and minority ethnic, especially in health and care work, and how community work is being disproportionately shouldered by women. Without a doubt, COVID is a feminist issue. So we'll now kick off with my guests, giving us a little bit more information about themselves. So welcome, Fiona and Lauren, and thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Poppy. I'll dive in. So I work for Scotland currently as the training and education coordinator for colleges and universities, as you said. So my role is around helping colleges and universities implement responses to gender-based violence. So a lot of the focus of my work is around the kind of training of staff to ensure that they give good responses to survivors, or that they can identify kind of situations of GBV when they see them. And also do some work with students as well around sort of prevention, changing attitudes, things like that. And a lot of the kind of focus of my work is actually getting universities and colleges to engage with their local gender-based violence specialists. So I work for the National Rape Crisis Scotland office, but there are local branches of Rape Crisis and Women's Aid kind of throughout the country. They're the kind of local experts. They're doing the service provision. So it's about getting universities to get involved with their local service providers who will actually be supporting the students or staff who experience gender-based violence. So we're ensuring that there's relationships there, there's referrals that go in, and also that local, usually underfunded services are being more appropriately resourced. So that's kind of the key part of my work with Rape Crisis Scotland. And as you said, on one day a week, I counsel survivors of sexual violence through Forth Valley Rape Crisis. So obviously that work really informs the rest of everything that I do. It's kind of vital work, I think, in itself, and really rewarding, but it kind of allows me to stay connected as well to really why we're doing all that work, what the need for good responses to GBV is.
Excellent, and I'll come in. It's Fiona Drouet, as you kindly introduced, Poppy, CEO and founder of the Emily Test. And it was set up in 2016 after we lost Emily to suicide, and while she was studying law at the University of Aberdeen. When we looked into what had gone wrong in Emily's situation, we realised that responses across Scotland in our universities, particularly were very patchy, and that was something we wanted to address. Emily had reached out for help, and sadly she got a really uninformed response, and that was something we wanted to change to make sure that no other family and no other young girl was left to suffer in the way that Emily was. So in the very early stages, the first part was to engage with NUS in Scotland, and then from that point we then lobbied the government to see what firm action could be taken at a ministerial level, and I'm really happy to say their response was robust and supportive, and we managed to get it written into the ministerial letter of guidance through the Scottish Funding Council that universities would have to evidence their work in prevention and intervention on campus, and if this wasn't evidenced in their outcome agreements to the Scottish Funding Council, funding would be restricted. So it has been a very successful campaign, and that work has been ongoing with all our valued partners such as Lauren in Rape Crisis, Women's Aid, Police Scotland, and in fact too many partners to mention, but the work continues to be strong in Scotland.
Thank you both so much for those comprehensive and powerful introductions to your work. I know myself, working as a GBV researcher and campaigner, that the work is incredibly demanding and often unmanageable at the best of times, let alone without the additional stresses from the COVID-19 pandemic. So we really are so lucky to be having you here today talking to us about your work. Thank you so much. To kick us off, we're going to be talking about what your personal worries are about the COVID-19 pandemic as a mother, as a campaigner, as a GBV worker, as an activist. So tell us, what are your personal worries?
So I think in terms of personal worries, well, my mum actually has COVID-19 right now. So on a really personal level, that is really kind of in there for me, that she's actually experiencing that right now, and it's really, really worrying, obviously. And I think but what that kind of leads me to think about is the fact of like what her role is. So she's like a care assistant, and you think about that as being like an incredibly sort of gendered role, really. And I guess like thinking about sort of the caring professions in general tend to be extremely gendered. So I kind of think that the people maybe most likely to be affected by this, and maybe who aren't being cared for themselves, I guess, if you think about it in terms of the government sort of response, are often likely to be women, and, you know, possibly also likely to be working class women. So that's something that kind of really stands out to me as like a worry. How's it affecting people who are already marginalised sort of through, you know, multiple lenses, I guess. And the thing that really sort of worries me, I don't know if this is necessarily a personal worry, but I kind of feel like we're being primed for this like austerity narrative. And it's sort of like, okay, right, you know, we're putting money into this now, but it's going to be a long, hard winter kind of thing. And I don't think it has to be that way, but it's almost as if we're being kind of I mean, not that we've ever left austerity really, but like the seeds are being sown basically to prepare us that there's going to be like a real difficult time coming after this, or more, you know, even more difficult time. And that makes me think about who's going to be affected in the long term in terms of services being cut and funding being cut. So those are some of my kind of worries that I've been thinking about recently.
Yeah, actually, I would, Lauren, I'm so sorry to hear about your mum. I really hope that she's okay, and I'm guessing, I don't know if she's in hospital or whatever, but I hope she's getting the best care possible. That's awful for you.
Yeah, thanks.
I think it is. It's such a worrying time for everybody, and I guess there are so many different things on it. Like Lauren was saying, there are things on a personal level where I look at the children and I feel Calvin, my son in particular, has just not long been able to kind of manage his separation anxiety since losing his sister, and that means, you know, managing to get him into school on a daily basis and managing to get him to function and not be scared of being alone with his thoughts and things. And we were just getting to, I guess, a really good place with him that was quite a relief to see. And I'm a wee bit worried that the effect of I'm not having to go into school on a daily basis is going to have when I'm after this. But we continue and try and manage that as a family. But I think what everyone is feeling with, and seeing, and obviously you hope the best outcomes for anybody that contracts this virus. But I think everybody is coming so much closer to the fact that we are so fragile, and it is really worrying for people. And actually, being a family that are bereaved, you can see people are maybe able to relate to that a wee bit more closely now, of how horrific that actually does feel, I think on a professional level, we've seen our projects have been continuing, but I absolutely echo what Lauren's saying. I really have concerns that, we are being prepared for the cuts that are going to happen, and what areas is that going to fall on? Well, I really hope it isn't in the area of gender-based violence, because we've made such huge strides across Scotland, and especially in our further in higher education field, and I really hope that just isn't set back by this. I think that would be absolutely devastating.
I think it's just so frustrating that there's this sense that all cuts have to be made, and I find it really frustrating in general. That, I mean, I am not an economist, very much far from it, but I think that we all have that understanding of like a country's economy as being like our own bank balances, and that's just not accurate. It's not the sense of like, oh, if I spend a bit here, then I have to cut a bit here. But I guess I think that is what's played on, essentially, that, if we spend a bit here, then we're going to have to cut later. And, just that doesn't actually have to be the case. And I find it really frustrating, much in the same way that I found it really frustrating that we're treating the NHS like a charity, basically. And I think that, people who are raising money for the NHS are obviously doing really great things, and it's great to see kind of communities pull together in that regard. But the narrative that's sort of been put across that actually it's not the government's responsibility to appropriately fund essential public services, like, I find that really worrying, and I wonder about what it kind of means for the future when after this is done.
Yeah, I think particularly so with the care sector, for example, when you're saying about your mum and you see these people day in, day out that are going out to save lives, to protect that generation, usually, our older generation, and they've got no equipment whatsoever to protect their own lives. It's so selfless, but surely as a bare minimum we can make sure they're protected. That, I find that really, really sad.
Yeah, and I think like it's interesting, I suppose, that because I think that there is a lot of, like bravery and selflessness that comes into doing any kind of caring role, but there's also the sense that, people are professionals, people are doing a job, and people should also be, remunerated for that job as well. And I think that, thinking about, nurses getting, not getting pay rises, or, the very limited wages, and who's expected to do certain kinds of work that, maybe isn't seen as particularly desirable or whatever. And I think that kind of hero narrative, again, like I keep saying the word narrative, but it's sort of been that, remember people used to refer to nurses as like angels, like, they're angels. It's like, no, they're not. They're people who are doing a really hard, really, really skilled job, and actually they're human beings and they need to be paid and they need to be supported to do that job. So I find that kind of conversation, it's almost like propaganda. Like when I see it online or on social media, that's the only word that kind of comes to mind for me.
Yes, absolutely, Lauren. And this is where we can see that the coronavirus is only partially a health crisis. It is also a political and an economic issue. And I agree, there are lots of nationalistic and austerity related and also militaristic agendas behind the public and governmental responses we're seeing to key workers and healthcare workers. So moving on to our next question. So applying an intersectional and feminist lens to the pandemic, we can come to see how COVID-19 is a health, economic, social and political crisis. But how is it also specifically a gendered crisis? Before you answer that question, I'm just going to read to you a few lines from an article I recently wrote, which I will link into the bottom of this podcast video. And that's on feminism and COVID and how COVID is a gendered issue. And then I'd love to hear your answers. So it says, among the inequalities that have come under sharper focus due to the COVID-19 pandemic is the reality of living in a male-dominated society. As the outbreak unfolded, predictable articles dominated our news feeds. Domestic violence has increased. Women are the ones being mostly laid off. Well, yes, we have long known that women are the dumping grounds and punch bags of crisis. Beyond such headlines, more fully fleshed realities of patriarchal society are becoming visible. Fear over your job security, working 24/7 to look after children and community, not being able to access the healthcare you need, restrictions on the body, being eyed up by strangers on the street, feeling intense fear on dark and empty streets, having your physical and financial freedom controlled, feeling anxious about home life, fretting about domestic continuity and resources for the family. During a recent podcast I recorded on motherhood and COVID-19, my two guests, PhD researcher Amy Andrade and solicitor Zima Dajani, put it perfectly. They said, "Welcome to our world." These are everyday realities for many women. The virus is a constant invisible fear, and women have come to know all too well a litany of constant invisible fears. So, opening the discussion back up to our two guests, how is COVID-19 a gendered crisis in your eyes?
Yeah, I had listened to the podcast, Poppy, and I thought it was an excellent way of putting it about that invisible threat and welcome to what we are feeling all the time when we walk down, a dark alley, or the kind of fear that the umbrella of fear that we can live under in day-to-day life. I thought it was a really good way of putting it.
I think what you said there about that sort of invisible threat is really interesting in terms of what women and other kind of marginalised people experience all the time, like a sense of underlying threat and hypervigilance. And I think that's really relevant. I actually saw someone just on Instagram make a post. And she was just saying, you would think that during quarantine or during lockdown, the catcalling would have stopped. It's like, there's meant to be less people out on the street, etc., etc. But yeah, it was just kind of like a reminder that, I don't want to be like life goes on, because that sounds like a positive thing. But there's sort of like, even in the midst of this, you're actually still, we're all dealing with that sense of feeling unsafe and fighting that sort of invisible threat. But, for many women, the kind of current sort of existing threats do go on at the same time.
It's been interesting, hasn't it, to see that a lot of the behaviours that you would think, I don't think they'll ever be put on the back burner, because that's just what people's attitudes are, But I mean, for example, over the last few days, I've had, I don't know how many follows, and when you click on the profile, it's pornographic content. It just begs the question, my God, do they ever just give up with this? It's actually, we're watching people die all around us, yet that's still the focus for so many.
Yes, absolutely, Fiona. And the normal challenges around getting GBV victim survivors to reach out or getting them to receive help has been compounded with the additional pressures and challenges of the global lockdown policies, where people are stuck in between four walls, and a lot of the services are feeling very overwhelmed right now.
Well, and as we're seeing, I do feel actually at first I probably felt quite an anxiousness about the number of people that we're going to experience this behind closed doors, and even the children and the difficult situations. Let's not forget this affects children of all ages and adults of all ages, and I just think it is a hugely worrying time to think of what people are going on behind closed doors, because there is nobody there to see it. So there are no limits to how far some of these abusers will go.
Yeah, the kind of misogyny just sort of continues unabated, really. I think kind of on the back of that, something I've noticed, or something I was just kind of thinking about, is the sense that I suppose it's not new. Like, I suppose, as we're saying, that these things continue. So there's a sort of sense of like, oh, but people, what about people in lockdown who can't leave? What about these children who are going to be abused? There's not the same oversight. And like, I totally agree that there is a lot of like relevant points in there, and obviously we are seeing sort of like an increase in terms of people seeking support, but the behaviour itself is not new or not. It's not just emerged because of the pandemic, and I think that sometimes that's almost what's been suggested, that actually people who are being abused within the midst of this pandemic were being abused before it as well. It's an intensification or a sort of exacerbation of already existing factors. And it's in the same way as we talk about like football or alcohol or whatever, like they don't cause domestic abuse. They don't just emerge from otherwise like lovely men or lovely people or whatever and sort of come out of this kind of vacuum. It's existing before this happened. So I suppose like shining a spotlight on it is a positive thing, but I think it can also be used in that sort of slightly excusing kind of way, like saying people like, oh, I think I'd seen some sort of headline or something. It was like the first like lockdown murder or something like that. And it was almost as if like the stress of lockdown got to this poor man, as opposed to, no, he was an abuser and he murdered his partner. And that's something that goes on outside of lockdown as well. That's not just about this pandemic.
Yeah, I think that's something that is really concerning when you see the headlines and it's almost like excusing it. They had a reason to do this. No, he's a murderer. That it's as simple as that. But I think the thing that worries me is for so many women where they do have this life at home, maybe in their normal way of life, they would be escaping that by going out to work or, just going about their daily life. Children, for example, who are living in a house where there's domestic abuse, they would be leaving that house and going into, the kind of support they've got outside of the house, in school, with their school teachers, or those networks of support are a wee bit more distant, although they'll have those connections online if they can reach them and if it's safe to do so. I just think it's such an intense time for these women and these families, and such, real feeling of isolation actually that must come with it. And I think with that whole pattern of abuse, facing no interruption at all in the home, you do wonder if there is an increased risk at the moment.
Yeah, I think like certainly like it sounds like there's probably been like an intensification. So yeah, I think that like it's almost like wanting to kind of hold the risks or acknowledge some of the differences and the changes and the massive impact that the pandemic will sort of inevitably have, while also not sort of just, excuse or sort of put it all down to that. It's a difficult balance, I think, and I suppose I don't necessarily see mainstream media kind of holding that balance, which is frustrating.
Yeah, you're absolutely. Yeah, it is really frustrating. I find you just want to say to the media, do you understand you are empowering abusers? They look for excuses. They can justify their behaviour all the time, and you are just giving them the tools to continue that. And I think also it's interesting when you look at the statistics. Yes, there's an increase in calls to the helplines, but there's also, if we look at sexual crimes, if we look at rape and things, and Lauren, you'll probably know more about the statistics than I do, but early indications show a slight reduction. And I think that does bring a whole load of fears. It doesn't mean that it's happening any less. It just means that people maybe aren't having the conversations where they would disclose, for example, speaking to a friend and saying this is what happened, and the friend then encouraging them to reach out and find support. So it's really quite, I think it's almost like a deafening silence. If with these people that aren't finding the support, you really worry what actually is going on behind that.
Yeah, and I think that I suppose like if we're seeing sort of an increase in number of calls to helplines and things like that, I think funding and resourcing for services and helplines and things is always an issue in itself. So it's almost like this kind of catch-22 maybe, that it's not as if there's like massive amounts of extra resourcing at this point, there's always unmet need, which is really unfortunate and sad to say, when it comes to people trying to access gender-based violence services. And that's not because services aren't working hard, it's because they're actually working at capacity and they just simply can't do anymore. So there's always that unmet need, and I wonder at the moment what that's looking like. I don't have an answer to that, but I suppose like whatever people reaching out for support, there's like massive implications there in terms of capacity and resourcing, and people not, then you, as you say, Fiona, you do worry like, well, what's going on there? Why are people not feeling able to reach out?
And is it maybe, so many things that do happen and so many reports come through, just those conversations with other people, connecting with other people, they've just not got the opportunity to do that just now. And it is worrying, because I think after this we're going to see, as predicted, a significant impact on everybody's mental health. I mean, I know that I've had to monitor my own mental health and to look after that of the families as well. And I think that's another huge concern, about the impact of that at the end of all of this, when we come out of the other end.
And I think just if we think about, obviously, sexual violence, domestic abuse, they are very gendered crimes. So the people who are more likely to be struggling with the impact of trauma from those incidents, I guess, are more likely to be women. And then on top of that, the impact of the pandemic. And I suppose from my kind of counselling work, I've definitely seen that there's already been an impact. I've had to move counselling sessions online, which in itself kind of creates like a massive sort of impact on terms of like what your relationship's like, the technology. It's very different. It is really great to be able to provide that, but it is a very different experience than actually being in a room with someone. And what is really like important about counselling is the relationship. So I suppose we're all experiencing that in general with like how it feels to move relationships online and catch up with family and friends via Zoom. And it's the same with counselling. And not all services have been able to do that. Not all services have been able to move everything session-wise online. So yeah, there's just a massive impact, I think, to people's kind of mental well-being. And I suppose something that I've noticed is people almost kind of being re-traumatised by things that are occurring with the pandemic. So survivors who have had past experiences of very controlling, abusive relationships, feeling that it's actually quite triggering to be told that you can't see your family, that you can't go out of the house, that you can't go to these certain places, and the sense of almost like surveillance, I think, that we've got at the moment. And, I think people are kind of, there can be slightly like that, people turning against each other and like watching and being like, have they gone out for 2 walks today? That kind of thing. And I think survivors are really feeling that, and it can feel quite triggering. So yeah, like you say, I kind of wonder when things have maybe returned to normality, what some of the impact of that might be.
Lauren, I have been wondering how it is affecting people doing these, kind of Zoom interviews or whatever, doing this online, because I know from my own experience with counselling, it was the bereavement counselling, that I think you go into this safe space when you're with your counsellor. So you are away from everything, you're away from your daily life, you're away from everybody, and that's why you can open up. Obviously, that's the whole thing, it's a safe place to open up. But if you're in the home and you're surrounded, it doesn't mean that there's any abuse in the home or it's not a safe place in the home, not necessarily, but it's just not the same experience.
I totally agree.
As just being away from that in a remote space with your counsellor. Yeah. So I've wondered how services are coping with that.
I think it's a really good point, because so people talk about like sort of online counselling, and there might be like a disinhibition that occurs. So you might get people feeling, because it's like an online kind of space, they are more likely to share things that they might not otherwise have shared if you'd been face to face, which for when it comes to trauma can actually be really really difficult. I think, if you had thought in your head, like, maybe there's something I want to talk about, but I'm not quite ready yet, but then the disinhibition occurs and you end up speaking about something before you felt ready, that can be re-traumatising for people, can leave people feeling really exposed and vulnerable. And like you say, then they're in their own home and they don't have that kind of sense of boundary or separation. I think on the other hand of it as well, you can almost get like an inhibiting effect when it comes to online counselling, because you are in your own home, you might be thinking like, who else is there? You don't feel quite as kind of comfortable or secure.
Exactly.
So there's so much to navigate, I think, for survivors who are accessing kind of counselling or support right now. So many things that you might not have like really thought. I mean, it's brilliant. It is brilliant to be able to like provide that accessible mode of counselling. And in some ways, it is actually great, because I think, you know, when it comes to maybe reaching people who do have kind of like accessibility kind of needs, then it's brilliant to be able to provide that service. But it is also really important to kind of note some of the shifts that might be occurring for people, and how it's going to actually impact on people's recovery.
Wow, thank you both. There is just so much for our listeners to digest and think about there. And thank you for bringing up those really intriguing points about how professional practice in the GBV sector has to adapt to the COVID-19 pandemic, and has to adapt very rapidly. You know, it felt kind of overnight that we went online. I think all of those discussion points and learnings can be brought forward to a wider conversation about how we can deliver GBV work through digital means as our working practices become even more technologised. So I'm hoping this pandemic will bring a lot of learnings to those conversations. Is there anything else you would like to add before we move on to our next question?
I think, you know, thinking about it in terms of, you know, more power for the police and things like that as well. When you think about, you know, that to me has felt really quite disturbing, that sense of, you know, more state power, I guess, like that sense of people being, you know, stopped and searched, and who that'll kind of, I mean, I suppose maybe that's maybe something we associate more with like young men, but definitely, I guess, I think that when there's sort of increased powers for the police, and maybe like it feels like maybe not quite as much oversight. I saw someone kind of saying something online about be prepared to ask the question, you know, what regulation am I breaking, and that kind of thing. I think that's, I don't know, that kind of felt quite worrying to me as well. Maybe a bit of a lack of, maybe I'm not making sense here, but yeah, like a lack of oversight or something. Because people are so worried, we can often kind of turn to that sort of like the police will fix it kind of thing. But actually, where does that lead us? I don't think it necessarily leads us somewhere good, really, for a lot of people.
So I think what you've both brilliantly illustrated there is how the COVID-19 pandemic has almost acted, and this is something that I wrote about in the blog that I mentioned, it's acted as a microscope to society that has brought everything into sharper focus. So, for example, the realities of women in the home, the realities of the scale of domestic violence, and I'm sure the specific issue of domestic violence and intimate partner violence and violence towards women that can occur within the confines of the home are relevant to both your work in different and intersecting ways. So, Lauren, obviously your work does relate to domestic violence, and Fiona, obviously, Emily's story intersected her relationship with the home and her existence in the home. So there are clear links there with your work, which we will go on to discuss more of in a moment. And just to add, although we obviously know as GBV campaigners and professionals that the crisis will lead to some sort of increase in domestic and intimate partner violence, I'm also interested in the less represented areas of violence against women that aren't being covered as much by journalists at the moment, such as cyber abuse, revenge pornography, online stalking, and the ways that male violence is adapting almost to the fourth industrial revolution, to a technologized and AI-oriented society, and how male violence is becoming more insidious and complex and anonymized and subtle through online platforms. And as we see life move online because of this pandemic, and it may change working practices forever in terms of how much work we do online and remotely, and how much we play out our intimate relationships online will also change forever as a result of this pandemic. And as more people, men and women, move online, how can we as GBV professionals and activists respond to these new forms of male violence on top of the long-standing, historical, obvious forms of violence that women can face in the home and during the pandemic, such as domestic violence? So I'm interested in what new violence we will be challenged with. So that leads nicely on to my next question, which is, what new challenges have come into your work as a result of the pandemic? So have you seen new focuses in your work? Have you had strained capacity? Have you had to adapt to online platforms? I would love to hear what specific new challenges have come from the pandemic in relation to your work.
I think, like what you said there is really interesting. I suppose what I think about whenever we talk about sort of online technologies being used as part of abuse is I always like to think about it as not really being so new in some ways. Like, and I think this is what you're getting at. It's like the form is new, or the technology is new, but the dynamics are exactly the same. But I think that when you were talking, it was really making me think about the kind of concept of boundaries. And I think we are in this quite like almost like boundaryless space right now. And I think often the response to sort of online abuse has been very much like, well, turn off your phone, or, get off Instagram or whatever. And actually we're seeing, like, in a really sharp way how that is absolutely impossible, and it was impossible before, because, people who are being, targeted by abuse shouldn't have to change their behaviour. But we can see that is always just the response, that they should have to do something different, or that it's their fault for behaving in some kind of way. But I suppose that the boundary between, like, real life and the internet is not as sharp. It's much blurrier than it ever has been before. And I suppose that's kind of what we're sort of experiencing. And I was thinking about, I've seen quite a few people kind of talk about the idea of, like, how do you end a phone call now when you've not got somewhere else to be? Or how do you end a meeting when you've not got somewhere else to be? And I think that kind of weird boundaryless space is quite strange. But it's also interesting, I think, that we have that idea that we can't just end a phone call because we want to end a phone call. Like, we're actually encouraged, and I think women especially are encouraged to not have boundaries and to not be able to just, we're always being socialised to kind of think about the impact on the other person in so many ways. So yeah, I don't necessarily have like a kind of firm set of thoughts on that, but I think like the lack of boundaries is something that I've kind of noticed as being a new challenge when it comes to work. And you're trying to sort of set these quite artificial boundaries. Like, I don't let myself go in my living room throughout the day because that's like my like not working room. So you have to kind of come up with these sort of like weird artificial boundaries. That's a challenge for me.
Wow, Lauren, I'm so impressed. I wish I was as disciplined as you. I have been in the living room, and I'm too often in the fridge as well. I wish I wasn't. But yeah, I think one of the things that you said as well, it's all really interesting, but a point that I was picking up there is, how we look at this digital abuse, and it's almost again like placing that responsibility on the victim, isn't it? Switch off your phone. So it's, why doesn't she leave? We never look at, well, why is he actually doing that? What, he should stop. It's not for her to manage it. And why is this happening in the first place? And as you both know through working with me, I'm really, really passionate about getting in at a younger age and looking at these things. And what kind of education are we putting out there? It's too vague, the education that we're going in with sexual education. We need to go in and we need to talk to boys and girls about what is happening in this online space, what is acceptable, what's not, what is healthy sex, what's not healthy, what's violence, what's abuse, and we need to make sure these boundaries are clear, because at the moment what I have a big fear is that we are leaving our children to self-educate online, and obviously because of what we've been through, as you both know, but we've got our daughter who's almost 17 and our son who's 14 and going to have his lockdown birthday actually this week, and I talk to him all the time, and my daughter all the time, about what is healthy in a relationship, what you should, how you should act and how you should expect to be treated, how you should be treating other people. And I guess I put a tweet out maybe at the start of lockdown saying, like, this is an amazing opportunity to sit down and educate our children, to talk to our children about what is healthy and what's not. And I guess one thing I hope is that it's not an opportunity that's going to be missed. We've got that time, we've got that one-on-one time with our kids. This is a real opportunity to have conversations that, as we know, could potentially save your child's life.
I think that is so important, and I suppose one of the things that it makes me think about is it's an amazing opportunity, but I guess at the same time, sometimes adults or parents don't actually have a better understanding of these issues than their kids do. Sometimes it's actually the reverse. I think that sometimes what we experience at Rape Crisis, we've got a national prevention programme that goes into high schools, so like every local authority. And there can be times where people who are in kind of positions of power or positions of kind of leadership really have quite sort of damaging viewpoints when it comes to like sexual and gender-based violence. So I suppose like it's always about like what is the source, I guess, like what are people learning, what are people's own understanding, how equipped are we as adults, I guess, to even be having those conversations. When I go in and deliver training to university staff, I mean, it's really interesting because some of those same conversations that my colleagues who are doing the high school work are having with teenagers, I'm having the same conversations with staff. So like across the board, I guess, it's just this sometimes lack of understanding. And don't get me wrong, sometimes like brilliant responses and sometimes like really like great like insight into the scenario as well. But I guess that's just always like what information are we actually receiving?
I think that's so important, and that's why I think there need to be some kind of national standards, and we need to make sure all of this, any education that goes into schools, goes into colleges, universities, workplaces, any education that is getting delivered, we need to ensure a certain standard. And for me, I believe it should be endorsed by violence against women professionals. And you're absolutely right, Lauren. I think that you have to be working in the space of seeing these survivors that are coming forward, because I know that when I've spoken to people, actually, when we found out what had happened to Emily, I mean, my God, we just couldn't believe half of it, because we had never come across some of the insidious behaviour that we were seeing that Emily had been subjected to. It would be unbelievable to us before to even imagine that half of that could happen. Violent sex and, all of these, and then the abuse that came after it in such horrific ways, that a lot of which that we've not even been able to speak about publicly, but some things that we wish we hadn't actually seen personally, because it kind of stays with you for a long time. But I think you're absolutely right. There are things that I can talk about that are happening now, and teachers and universities and even, government level people can be so shocked that this is actually happening all around us, because it is getting more disturbing, a lot of this violence. And I do think what you were touching on, Poppy, is the influence that pornography is having on all of this. And if we don't educate our kids that this isn't normal, we're going to see a huge, huge damaging effect coming from that, not only for the people that it's inflicted upon, but the perpetrators themselves and the people that are actually watching pornography. I mean, I remember Childline releasing some figures, and it was 30% of 18 to 24-year-olds are experiencing some form of erectile dysfunction as a result of excessive porn usage, and you just think, well, actually, we need to guide our children and let them know the damage they're doing to themselves, not only, by watching this, but they're doing to themselves. It's not just when they transfer that into a relationship.
I think, I suppose what is kind of making me think about is, in terms of new challenges for my role, it has been that sort of lack of ability to actually, I suppose, in some senses, do a large part of my job. So a lot of my job is about face-to-face kind of delivery of training and education and engagement with people, and that's just obviously had to be cancelled at the moment and rescheduled. And I suppose I've had kind of thoughts about, could some of that stuff be moved online? But I think the way that I deliver work is much more kind of about facilitating conversations between different people. It's not me standing up there just lecturing people on what to think or what to believe. I like to engage people in a dialogue, and so we can all kind of learn from each other and sort of collaborate and figure things out together. And it's hard to transfer that, I think, to an online kind of platform. So it's about, well, how is that work going to look in the future? Is it, I suppose, as we've maybe mentioned, is that going to be on top of the priority list when, universities are back kind of delivering face-to-face teaching? And I guess that's kind of some of the worry about those relationships continuing and things staying on top of the priority list, because I think there can be that kind of why are you talking about this now? This isn't the time kind of attitude.
I really hope, Lauren, that, along with me, we've been working closely with the universities and colleges, and they are really engaged. And I think actually the education that they've had since the whole Equally Safe in Colleges and Universities working group started, I really do think that passion to continue this work will remain, whether or not resources are there to do that. But there are ways that I feel the institutions could use the finances that they have available to them in a bit of a smarter way. So, for example, looking at our violence against women agencies and engaging with them for training and all of these kinds of things. So I guess it's about them becoming smarter with their finances in that way. And I don't think that's a negative. I think that's a good thing, and it's a change that I would have liked to have seen happen so that we have got this sustainable model. But I agree with you about the changing our work and how it's been really challenging not being able to go into the same space. I mean, each time I go in and I speak in schools or if I speak in universities and colleges, you do get these disclosures. Every time there's a disclosure, and I think, gosh, each time that one of these events has been cancelled in one of those spaces for me because of the pandemic, you think it's someone else not disclosing, and not getting that opportunity to engage with them. And I remember when each time we do this, a lot of people say, gosh, we need to get you speaking in every university and every school. Everybody needs to hear this. And I've said the same as you, Lauren. I don't think it is as effective digitally. I think it's very much an interactive thing that you do in these spaces, and that's why it's the emotion in the room, isn't it? How do you capture that online? Yeah. I think it's impossible, actually. So yeah, it's something that, well, it's not impossible. Everything's possible. We'll need to find a way around it. Maybe as people get more used to talking to each other on this space, it will become more comfortable for everybody, and we will manage to gather that emotion online. I just don't know what it is. It's just a new experience for everyone, and it is a challenge.
I suppose one of my worries is that going back to what you were saying, Lauren, about austerity, that the economic impacts of the COVID pandemic will push the GBV and violence against women agenda kind of into the shadows a bit and push it further down the agenda. So I'm worried about how cuts following the pandemic will be gendered. I'm also worried about other focuses being claimed as more important. So I'm not sure if you both know this, but only about 1% of literature on disease and pandemics looks at the gendered impacts. So that's an interesting finding from the academic world. And then also, not many people know this because, again, journalism is gendered. More women died during the Ebola outbreak from obstetric complications as a result of the shift of resources away from maternity services than from the actual Ebola itself. And so I think that the gendered impacts of this pandemic will potentially be long lasting. And I'm very worried about the agenda item of GBV moving further away from the main focuses during and after the pandemic.
Totally, yeah. It's a really interesting point about like the resources being shifted away from certain services or certain sort of focuses, and then who's really impacted by that. And like I suppose, as you said, there it is, the really life or death thing that we're talking about. It's not minor.
Mm-hmm. I think that's it. It is a worrying time, and I think everybody is concerned. I suppose and I don't know why I'm still an optimist, but I suppose I'm just looking at the response from the Scottish Government so far, and knowing that they gave that 1.5 million to rape crisis and to women's aid, I suppose gives me a wee bit of hope that the focus will remain high on gender-based violence. And also, I think it would be something that would be really difficult for them to ignore when we've got the statistics behind it to prove the increase in domestic abuse during this time. So, overall, there is a concern about how this is going to affect women at the end of it. But I really hope that as long as our government keeps that focus, and I guess it's up to people like us, isn't it, as activists, to ensure the focus remains on women.
Oh, Fiona, yeah, you give me so much energy.
I was just going to be like, Fiona, you're like so much more of an optimist than I am. I'm like, oh, it's awful, it's the worst, it's terrible. But I guess, like, I suppose one thing that it's made me think about is, I mean, Rape Crisis Scotland throughout this has been a really great organisation to work for, and they responded really quickly and, really put our needs kind of very at the top of the agenda in terms of us being workers. And I suppose, like, I've been thinking about other people who aren't as lucky and whose organisations have not responded in that way. But I suppose it's also, I guess, like, as you said, Poppy, it's been like a microscope, and it's really like focused in on things that are already there and already existing in terms of like precarity. But one thing I suppose I've been thinking about is when you work in the third sector and when you work with gender-based violence, you are actually in quite a precarious situation in general. You rely on grant funding. The longest you tend to get out of that is like 3 years. It's not a long time to do like really good. I mean, you can do good, meaningful work, but it's not a long time. And like priorities can shift and agendas can change. And I suppose the thing that I think about as well is like when you're dealing with trauma, you want to be, what's really important is to kind of be providing a secure kind of base of like safety and sort of stabilisation for people so that they can then build on that and they can recover from trauma as well. And it's really hard to do that if you as a worker are in a really precarious situation yourself. So I suppose that's a challenge. We've got like quite a lot of workers at the moment who are waiting on funding being renewed, or applications are in, people potentially losing funding, losing their jobs amidst all this, trying to deliver gender-based violence services. I know my funding was up recently, and it was very sort of like up to the wire when I found out when that was going to be renewed. So I suppose I'm thinking it's a challenge, but it's a consistent challenge of providing kind of trauma services, really.
It is interesting, Lauren, because it's an ongoing challenge that the sector faces. As you were saying, it's something. I mean, I remember when we were applying for additional funding for the Equally Safe in Colleges and Universities project to continue. I mean, it was just me coming in and my introduction into the third sector at that time when we set up this charity. And I can remember being so shocked and horrified that there were staff with such amazing expertise in this field being lost because they had no guarantee that the funding was going to continue. And I thought, what an absolutely awful way to run things, because we are losing amazing expertise and people that are really, well trained in this area, because they can't live their life in such an unpredictable way. They can't get mortgages. I mean, it's a sector that a lot of people don't understand.
That's totally true. And like, what's something that I've kind of been thinking about as well throughout all this in terms of that sort of precarity is that I suppose normally when you're providing some kind of counselling or support, the person doesn't really know anything about you. Whereas in this scenario, we're all going through this together. So if you are a survivor and you're very anxious and you're traumatised, you're kind of, I suppose, you're understanding that your counsellor, your worker is also in that sort of like this pandemic and also going through that. And I suppose I wonder kind of what impact that's having as well on containing survivors' anxieties about what's going on, if they're really struggling kind of with their mental health or their well-being. Kind of thinking about that, we're all in this together is quite a nice message, but at the same time can also be like, oh my God, like it's so out of control, no one knows what's going on. Even my counsellor, even my worker, she can't provide that sort of security that I'm looking for. I just think it's had such an impact that, you would never have thought necessarily about these things, but it's been huge.
It's a huge impact on everybody, hasn't it? And I think, sometimes, I don't know, I guess looking at our own trauma, and I hate to sound as though I'm selfish, but I guess just looking at, where coming from our family, it's an awful, I'm trying to think of how I can phrase this so that it doesn't sound really, really selfish, but actually sometimes you feel less alone because you feel other people are now experiencing this same kind of fear that I guess we face in everyday life. I don't know if that makes sense. It's almost like the kind of hell that we faced as a family was completely unimaginable for anybody, and it's almost like everybody is starting to maybe be able to connect to other people that are suffering. So you see a lot of people saying, will it make the world a kinder place? Well, maybe it might, because a lot of us have come so much closer to losing what is so precious to us. I don't know.
Isn't it so devastating how these deaths and this suffering is so preventable, and so much of the GBV work is focused on wanting to prevent the suffering in the first place? Yeah,
I know. I think that's heartbreaking. I think when you see, we know with Emily that was preventable. Emily could still be here if there had been sufficient intervention, and that's just one person. And that's the case for so many. And when you see the murders that we've seen, I think the one where the woman was out in the street and she was screaming, she was yelling for help, and she was slayed and in the street and murdered, and none of the neighbours came out to help. That to me, it was just a repeat of what we had seen. When people see these things happening and just not speaking out and not doing anything to avoid it, it just adds an extra dimension to any pain you're going to suffer when you lose somebody, to know that it could have been avoided. And yet we're seeing that day in and day out just now, whether it's with our women that are working on the front line and our men, or the women that are losing their lives because of domestic abuse.
Absolutely. Thank you for such a powerful and moving comparison and illustration there, Fiona. And to all of our listeners, we will be linking in support contacts at the bottom of the podcast. So please do reach out if you are affected or anyone you know is affected by any of these issues. There are people out there willing to listen and hear your voice and help. And thank you, Lauren, just kind of going back a couple of steps to highlighting the broader issues in the sector and making this really intriguing comparison between the ways we treat feminized roles and work. So, for example, charity work, and the way that we treat women generally. So the kind of low pay, the precarity, the low socioeconomic and cultural value, unmanageable workloads. I think that's such an important link to make, how we treat and conceive feminized labour and how that's a mirror of how we treat women. Absolutely. So moving on to, if that's okay, to policy and institutional responses. So I'd like to ask you both, what governmental responses do you think have been positive and negative for GBV work? You can talk about the Scottish Government, Westminster, or even other institutional responses that you've seen that you've been particularly impressed by or shocked by. Over to you.
I was going to say, I think for me, the fact that we are here at all is a negative response. Sort of like with kind of information coming out that things were known about early on, that, and that the response was lacking, I guess. That's obviously extremely disappointing, although, to be honest, not surprising to me. So I think that that's something that, it's not necessarily within what's been going on overall, but I suppose just the fact that we have got to this stage and that there's been that real lack of so much of it, I suppose, that as we were talking about, could have been preventable or avoided getting to this stage. That's been disappointing.
Yeah, I guess if I look at the positives, I look at how swiftly a lot of the universities have responded to it and making sure that they took care of the students' mental health. But however, as you both know, we feel it's a negative that rent suspensions didn't happen right away for all sorts of reasons. And if you want to look at that through the lens of gender-based violence, it could be that it maybe forced some people to stay in certain residences where they aren't safe because that was the only one they could afford. There are potential negative outcomes from the rent not being suspended at the start, not to mention the stress and anxiety that was unnecessarily placed upon students and their families. So a really positive response to the mental health, but and as you know, we sent out a letter about gender-based violence to the sector, to the university sector and to the college sector to say, make sure this isn't put on the back burner. Here are the things that we would recommend that you address during the pandemic, and that has been really well received. I know all 19 principals of all the institutions in Scotland have received that, and College Development Network have circulated that, and that was kindly endorsed by Rape Crisis, Women's Aid, Samaritans and Police Scotland, all our sorry, actually not Police Scotland, but really our valued colleagues who understand that it's important to keep this high on the agenda. So some of those points, and Poppy, you and I worked on this together, is things like making sure under your signature you do make, signposts to these domestic abuse helplines, things like that, just to reinforce that message continually that help is at hand and that you're not on your own, you don't need to suffer in silence with this, and your institution, while busy with so many other things at this moment in time, is here to support you. And I think, and I'm sure it was you, Poppy, that made a point on Twitter perhaps the other day. I do think, I guess we touched on my optimism earlier on, and I still question myself why I am so optimistic, but I think we've had such a good response to our campaign, and having experience of working with Scottish Parliament, Scottish Government, and looking at Westminster, I feel quite blessed almost that we do live in Scotland, because we have got a model that is easier to, I don't like to say influence, but to work closely with, whereas in Westminster, I think they've got a bigger challenge in the rest of the UK than we have in Scotland. I think we've got a really reactive, a government that is listening to us and that is placing this high in their agenda. So I think their reaction by giving the funding to Women's Aid and to rape crisis was great. And that is not by any means saying I don't think more can be done. I think there is more to be done. But I definitely think we're in a more advantageous situation than the rest of the UK.
Absolutely, and we will be alongside help and support contacts, be linking in some of the incredible work that Fiona has outlined there. So thank you both very much for those answers. And I'd just like to add a couple of sentences of my own. So what I've been really impressed by is the kind of collective action that we've seen under the lockdown policies. And I'm speaking about that in a kind of general sense, the kind of community spirit that we've seen, the exchange networks, the help networks. However, I think going back to what I was saying about digitized and technologized violence against women, I have been very disappointed at the lack of guidance and advice that has been given out at a governmental level, at institutional levels, and coverage in journalism, because this is a real and an omnipresent threat for women. And if we increased that support and that coverage, it could save lives. So that's my 2 cents.
No, can I say something? I absolutely agree with you. And when that came to mind was when we saw the latest campaign, the campaign the police have launched into child exploitation online. I would love to see something like that around gender-based violence. And if we could see that, I think that would be quite significant, and it would just be a kind of light bulb moment for a lot of people that are experiencing that just now.
Absolutely. And I just wanted to briefly highlight and reiterate your point earlier, Lauren, that we make these kind of dichotomized distinctions between new and old crime. But as you say, it's so important to remember that these are blurred dimensional worlds of real and online life. And we're actually seeing the continuation of really ancient forms of misogyny repackaged in new ways. So we've got to be careful in kind of reinventing the wheel or thinking that it's this kind of new phenomena. They're just new challenges, and I'm interested to see how we will navigate those. But I think we need to navigate them quite urgently. Technology is evolving at a rate that kind of escapes our vocabulary, and we need to ensure that our advice and support is evolving with that. But that obviously ties into lots of the kind of austerity issues and how that stalls innovation in the sector. So thank you so much for those really important points, both of you. Looking at what is it that we are doing well and what is it that we're not doing well in terms of supporting victim survivors during this time. Is there anything else you wanted to add before we move on to our final quick fire round question?
No, I think it's right. I think sorry, what you were saying, Lauren, is right, that, this has always gone on, just because, it's maybe we're seeing more of it in the media and it's been reported and all this attention. It's not something that hasn't been there. I do think it has intensified. And I think with the digital means that people, that abusers have, I think it's just, I'm trying to think of how I phrase this. It's not that the abuse hasn't always been there. It's just now that they have more opportunities with these digital means to stalk, for example, to monitor every single movement of their victims. So they have more ability to control than they ever did have before, I guess.
Thank you both. So moving on to our final question, because I'm very aware that I've kept you here for 2 hours.
We would talk about this all day, all of us.
God, I'm so sorry, but there's just so much to cover, and you're just both such amazing experts and so knowledgeable. So what I was thinking, imagining I'd be able to condense this to an hour, half an hour, what was I thinking? So my final question to you is, and this is just, a bit of a quick fire round question just to wrap things up nicely. If you could wave a magic wand and change anything right now in the pandemic, what would that be? So use your feminist imaginations here.
You know, I think I always think about having a magic wand, and I think the main thing that always gets to me is thinking of these people behind closed doors that are scared and they feel there's no way out. And everybody says reach out, but I just want people to know that we don't see that. That's not oversimplifying the situation someone's in. It's just, I think, once you come into this world of seeing the support that is out there for people that have experienced gender-based violence, you really want them to reach out, because there's amazing help out there, as you can hear from Lauren and from colleagues in Women's Aid, and people are really passionate about this. They want to help, and something that you think isn't happening to anyone else is happening to so many others. So I think that would be my magic wand, to be able to say that to people, just to encourage them to reach out, because there is help there. I just wish we could get them to see that.
On sort of slightly less kind of, because I've been thinking a lot about like what you said, Poppy, about that kind of like collective and kind of community care that's going on, and being really like inspired by that. And a slightly less collective community care type note, if I could wave a magic wand, I would make my mum not have COVID-19. But on another side of it, I would seize Jeff Bezos's assets and put them to good use. So that would be my magic wand. He would wake up with no money, and we would fund the gender-based violence sector appropriately, as well as many other sectors, with his money. So sorry, Jeff, but that's what I would do.
Well, I'll get on with rubbing my genie lamp for both of you there. I suppose my wish would be, in terms of that community work, taking a more critical approach. I would like to see more men picking up that workload, because it is disproportionately women who are, this is obviously emulating patterns, wider patterns. It's mostly women who are carrying out that work, and it is women who often carry us through crisis. So I would like to see that distributed more evenly, and but I suppose on a much more philosophical level, I would love to just live in a world free of gender-based violence.
Yeah, I suppose that kind of community and collective response has been, like I said, inspiring, even though I do think, like as you said, there needs to be kind of more of a critical lens on it. I think that it's like I wish that was going to be kind of carried through. And I think that's like, if we could really build on that, or if that could be the sort of like real main narrative, as opposed to this, like I said, austerity, also like people kind of turning against each other and sniping. So it's like, if I could wave a magic wand, if this is like a magic wand that has, obviously I would just want the pandemic not to occur, for there to be no GBV, for all these kind of things. But thinking about sort of maybe what I would want to kind of see continue after this is just like, it's just that being really foregrounded, that kind of like, if we come together, how can we care for each other, as opposed to either turning against each other or kind of going back into this like real individualistic kind of self-care kind of narrative. I really need to get a new word and stop saying narrative, but I think that it can be frustrating when we don't kind of see the wider structures and see how we're all kind of stronger together, and we do kind of go into that like real individualistic kind of space. So yeah, that's what I would kind of want to see past or post pandemic, is like a real foregrounding of the community.
Yeah, and I think when you were saying about looking at getting more men into this space, and particularly so in gender-based violence, and just working to help other men see that there are good men that don't agree with the abuse. And I think the other thing, I guess we focus on men, but I think we've also got to focus on some women, don't understand what domestic abuse is, what gender-based violence is, and that's where, you know, we can come into this very victim-blaming culture. And I just would love to see women being more supportive of other women and holding each other up instead of sometimes bashing each other down.
Absolutely. I mean, I've said this before, I think, to you, Fiona. Patriarchy is successful because more than 50% of the population practices it and endorses it and engages with it and supports its values in many ways. And women, absolutely, we don't talk about that enough, can also be vehicles for victim-blaming behaviour, and, you know, can slut shame other women or deny other women's voices and stories. So it is about us all seeing a collective future where a gender-based violence-free world is one that benefits us all. It won't just benefit certain groups of women, it will benefit us all. Absolutely.
Yeah. And about, you know, if we can all support each other and women can stop the victim blaming of, as you said, the slut shaming, or, you know, she was drinking too much or she was flirting or whatever the excuse is, where they always place this blame on the victim, we would really be worlds ahead in this fight against gender-based violence. I don't think these women that act in that way understand quite how much they empower perpetrators.
Absolutely. Thank you. That's a powerful and intriguing note for us to end on and think about. I think with this pause that we have during the pandemic, it could be a time, and I talk about this in the blog that I just wrote, it could be a time where we could revisit the principles of the women's liberation movement and kind of go inwards and think, what is it that we want our movements to do, and how do we want them to behave? And I think it's a time when we can think about our own behaviour, and come out of, you know, if there are positive things to come out of the pandemic.
I think that's a really good point. I think that we can all sort of talk about like our values or the values of the violence against women sector, or, you know, whatever. And it's actually like, well, what are they? Like, are we all on the same page? Are we being as critical as we need to be sometimes? Are we being as radical as we could be? And actually like look at our own sort of values and whether we're actually really acting in accordance with them. I think, yeah, that it would be really good, because I think that's where people can go to that kind of defensive place, or just doing things in an old way.
And Lauren, some of that I think comes because of this funding model. So there are often so many of these charities, kind of all competing for the same funding from the same pot, you know. So I think that's sometimes where there can be a breakdown in the relationships. But luckily in Scotland, I think we've got really good collaboration, but I think it's a shame if we could find a way around that so that everybody did work. Really, as you said, Lauren, we've all got what we all want. We all want an end to gender-based violence, so let's just all work together because we have got the same goals.
Yep.
I was going to say something else about the Poppy, you and I, obviously we've been working on focus groups, and Lauren, I know through your work you'll have seen this a lot, but I thought something that was particularly sad when we look at victim blaming is two people that had really bad experiences of rape, and one said how shamed they were for speaking out and reporting it and ruining his life. And then the other ones said how shamed they were for not reporting it and not doing anything to protect future victims.
Mm-hmm.
So you think that in itself just really stood out to me. I thought, how awful is it that you are damned if you do it and you're damned if you don't? Well, that's us as a society that need to look at our own attitudes and how we support people when the worst thing happens to them in life. We should be doing better.
Yeah, there's no such thing as a kind of perfect victim. There's no real right way to do this. And I think that you can, I mean, from my work kind of counselling and supporting survivors, the things that people manage to blame them for is really quite astounding. And And I completely agree.
Awful. And that's where Rape Crisis are doing great work with the Rosie project, going into the schools and actually talking to them, because I've said it throughout this podcast, I'm a real believer that getting to our children, our people, this generation at a younger age is going to be where we see the biggest change.
Thank you both so much. So we will have to finish there, although I'm sure we could talk for weeks on these fascinating issues. So thank you both so much. So on the podcast today, we've had Fiona Drouet, founder and CEO of the Emily Test, and Lauren O'Rourke from Rape Crisis Scotland. Thank you both so much. You've been listening to the Difficult Conversations podcast series. See you next time.